So here we are this afternoon with Professor Neil Fleming, currently at the University of Worcester, and we're really pleased to have him to talk to about his book, The Marquis of Londonderry: Aristocracy, Power and Politics in Britain and Ireland. And I really do hope that those of you who are not Northern Irish are able to understand us, because inadvertently it transpires that we are in fact both Northern Irish. But we're going to talk really carefully for those who are not Northern Irish and may find that the general speed that the Northern Irish speak at is problematic. But we will keep that in mind, won't we, Neil?
I will, Joe.
As we continue, because it is a thing. So it's a funny old thing that there are two Northern Irish people studying Lord Londonderry, which is quite a thing in a way. But I'd love you to tell me how you came to be such a ranking expert on Londonderry. What's the story that led you to write this book?
I first, as a child and growing up in Northern Ireland, encountered him, I suppose, through the National Trust property at Mountstuart, but didn't think much at that young age. But at university, I came across his role in trying to reform education in Northern Ireland, and I was really struck that in the early 1920s, at such a crucial formative moment, someone was actually trying to create a school system in which religious background was irrelevant. And it seemed such a striking thing from almost a century before that I became really intrigued that this aristocrat was involved in that. So he hooked my interest really through discovering that. And then coming across his role with particularly appeasing, the question of appeasement in Nazi Germany, it just made him even more interesting.
So interesting, because then we both grew up with the legacy of that, didn't we? Of segregated schooling, where if you're Catholic, you went to one school, and if you're Protestant, very strictly, you went to another. And I think it's fair to say that that contributed to the conflicts from, that lasted from, say, 67 up until the 1990s. And it's a tragedy, really, that Londonderry wasn't able to do more. And it's to his credit that he tried to stop that
Yeah, I mean,
division.
it's certainly exacerbated divisions. I don't know if things would have been very different. I once gave a talk about this in 5 Mile Town, and somebody from the audience quite rightly said to me, but Yugoslavia, Yugoslavian case children went to similar schools and it didn't stop it descending into bloodshed. But I think there is something odd in Northern Ireland in that it's not until people arrive at university in Northern Ireland, if they stay in Northern Ireland, that many are actually educated together in inverted commas. And if they leave for education somewhere else, or indeed if they leave education altogether, then they've never been educated with the other side, to use the local parlance.
It's a fascinating thing. So, this is the book of your PhD. It's been revised and now it's out. It's been out with Bloomsbury. So, how did you come to write it, and what did you think was the gap in the literature?
As I say, I first came across them studying history at Queen's, but the gap, when I was interested in doing a PhD, this huge trove of papers were sitting in Balmoral, the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, and they included letters from Churchill and several kings and senior politicians from Britain, Ireland and beyond, and it just seemed to me amazing that no one had actually engaged with this stuff, and so that made me interested in writing about Londonderry himself. It also meant I could write not just about the history of Northern Ireland, but the history of Ireland and the history of Britain and the history of UK-German relations and arguably Europe. It was an attractive topic for that reason.
So he was the world in microcosm, or
Yeah, a prism through which, with a very strong local connection, with which you could tackle subjects which ordinarily, if you were doing Northern Irish history, you wouldn't venture much beyond the island of Ireland and maybe Westminster, but not much beyond that.
So I've written a couple of biographies, and I do think something happens when you write about a person, that it's almost like you're part undertaker, part lover, part best friend. You see things others don't see and read things that others haven't read about a person. There's an intimacy about a biography that's unreplicatable in any other relationship. I think. How did you end up, deep down feeling about Londonderry before and after, or maybe you've kind of lived with him over time now? How is what's been your arc of thinking about him?
I, I think different bits of his career and his life have attracted attention from different types of historians. So his role as a mine owner, for example, has been touched upon by people looking at the coal industry and trade unionism in the coal fields, and again the Irish context, people interested in Irish politics and diplomatic history on the appeasement side, but there was never any joining up of those things. No one ever seemed to perceive any consistency because they didn't look for it. And I felt that actually, if you take his life in its entirety, there is a consistency to it, and that helps to explain the unpleasant things, such as things that are naturally unpleasant to us, like promoting appeasing of the Nazi regime, with things which are lesser known, such as his relative, and I do stress relative, moderation as a coal owner, back to what we were discussing about what we would today call integrated education. And to me, there was a consistency that shone through that, which was only possible to see if you looked at his life in its entirety.
And what's the nature of that consistency?
Well, I suppose in some ways he wasn't an ideologue. He wasn't a nationalist in the conventional sense, as in British or Irish or European. But he believed in public duty. We probably laugh at these ideas these days, and probably rightly so, but he passionately believed in someone of his rank should perform public service, and that was instilled in him. And so, when it came to politics, he did bend with the wind to some extent. So, in his conservatism, for example, he, despite appeasement, some people often assume those who appeased were on the right. That's far from the case. He was a moderate conservative. That's a relative notion, but he was a moderate conservative in the British context. He changed his mind about lots of things to fit in that sense. But when he was a minister, and any of the ministerial portfolios he held, he believed in something like a sacred duty to serve the interest of that ministry, and that clashed with so his political flexibility came into conflict with that more rigid "I must stick by the ministry" line. So the consistency there is this notion of public duty. What is public duty mean in each circumstance? So in the case of politics, the Conservatives, from his perspective, must be elected. Therefore, they cannot be class warriors against the Labour Party, for example. They must bend with economic policy. There must be greater role for the state in the economy, for example. But as, say, Air Minister or Education Minister in Northern Ireland, he took the ministry line and resisted pressure from above to moderate his position, and for that reason was kicked out of office on both occasions.
So he is someone you'd like to have a beer with, kind of thing.
I would. I've read so many of his letters, and he wrote prodigiously correspondence. I feel like I have got to know him. I mean, the trouble about reading someone who's complaining, particularly in the latter part of his career, is there's an awful lot of complaining, and it can make someone seem less likable, or indeed someone you wouldn't want to have a drink with. But I think he was an interesting character. He represented a 19th century mentality into the 20th century, which was interesting in of itself. And as far as I can tell, most of the people who dealt with him liked him personally. What they found frustrating was his sense of self-entitlement, his confidence in his own views, and the seeming ease with which he seemed to get office. That certainly caused resentment among middle-ranking politicians who couldn't quite understand how this person was a cabinet minister, for example.
Right. Well, now we've led up to the elephant in the room of privilege. Would you like to just, for especially for people who don't really know who the Londonderrys are, and how he might have achieved position, could you perhaps say a little bit about how much his wealth and inherited wealth and wider context contributed to him having the status that he did have within politics?
Well, clearly it was the main reason. The family were enormously wealthy on the back of coal. owning coal pits, as they called them in County Durham, and that was from the English side of the family. So there was a sense there was two branches in effect. In the case of the third Marquess, came together, and so the Irish, the upwardly mobile Irish aristocratic side, married into this phenomenally wealthy English side, the Vane Tempests, who owned these mineral-rich lands, and that supplied the Londonderrys with the money to be able to push themselves further up in society, up the ranks of the nobility. But you still needed to have some sort of talent or ability or skill of some description. The first Marquess was made first Marquess because of his son. He was an earl. The son, the famous Lord Castlereagh, meant that his father was elevated. The third Marquess didn't amount to much politically. Neither did the fourth Marquess or the fifth Marquess. So it's just being rich on itself doesn't mean you get to join the cabinet or you become a person of consequence. In his case, his parents, the sixth Marquess and Teresa Londonderry, were very, very keen to push him into political life. The sixth Marquess had some modest political success. He had a formidable wife who wanted the family to do even better. And in a sense, Charlie, the seventh Marquess, as he became, was her project. He was going to fulfill this destiny for the family to bring it back to the times when Lord Castlereagh was such a prominent and widely known figure.
And he did have, I mean, the reason I asked the classic 20th century question, of a politician, would you like to have a beer with him, is because he did have certain charismatic qualities, very attractive to women and very open to liaisons with women. Not a great public speaker, as I understand it, but likable. People tend to say they really liked him. He had certain capability. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I think people might say these days his heart was in the right place, but of course that does depend on your point of view, depending on the issue at hand. He was likable, and a lot of things are said. Going back to your previous question about, say, the Londonderrys having these massive house parties in London in their Park Lane mansion, and people tut-tutted, and but they still turned up, and they turned up in their hundreds, and even after, which I didn't fully appreciate in the first version of the book, when I came to revise it, and I read the lists of attendees in the Times newspaper and went down the names one by one. People who were critics of appeasement still turned up to Park Lane to be hosted by Edith Londonderry in one of her famous parties in that house. So a lot of people, if you like, were arguably somewhat hypocritical. They didn't like this, but they still wanted to attend these things and be part of them.
So it is true you can cater your way into government in this period, as was said.
Lord Birkenhead said that. Lord Birkenhead, F.E. Smith, when he was a young man, of course, was very happy to attend functions at Londonderry House under Teresa, Lady Londonderry. So he was part of that. But as a younger man in his latter years, he became somewhat critical. I think it's more complicated. I think if you look at Londonderry's role in the general strike, and the perception that he was a moderate, and he was trying to reach some sort of, trying to bring the other coal owners to what was seen as a moderate position in their ranks, I think that endeared him to sections of the Conservative Party who, after the general strike, were very nervous that the Labour Party could make a lot of capital out of the notion that Conservatives were class warriors, and that they were not just going to put, the general strike was not only being won, in inverted commas, by the government, the Conservative government, but they were going to seek revenge. And they did to some extent with a bill the following year, which made life more difficult for trade unions. But Baldwin, in the meantime, was trying to find back-channel ways of reaching a more moderating understanding with the TUC in particular, but others within the trade union movement. And Londonderry, in that sense, went from being a liability. Here's a man who owns a coal mine here at the centre of this hugely controversial and prolonged strike. Of course, the miners were on strike for most of 1926 when everyone went back. Here was a moderate mine owner, a leader of the Conservative Party in a mining area. And in that sense, he turned a negative into a positive. So Londonderry, the following year, for example, when Baldwin's backbenchers wanted to advance a very punitive bill I mentioned, Londonderry was wheeled out to argue against it. and so a very wealthy co-owner trying to say, no, we don't need to do this. We don't need supplementary legislation. We can manage this. So yes, the catering mattered, but there were other factors too. And another one, again, easily forgotten if we just focus on, say, coal or Nazis or Irish affairs, is the question of India. Baldwin, by 1929, 1930, the leadership of the Conservative Party had come to the realization that India might become another Ireland. And he needed moderate voices in the Conservative Party to talk about the necessity of avoiding that, of avoiding alienating Indian nationalism to the extent where a Sinn Féin-like movement would achieve ascendancy. So there were steps taken in the early 30s to prepare self-government in India. It was limited by various things, but a measure of self-government that would have been unthinkable a decade before. And Londonderry not only simply agreed with that, whether it was, I think he had convinced himself, but he went out, he gave talks around the country about the importance of this and why it was necessary, and to keep India within the empire, it was necessary to give this generous measure, what they called a generous measure of self-government. But he was an Irish aristocrat. He was an Ulster Unionist aristocrat. So it wasn't just any peer standing up saying we must grant India self-government. It was someone with that Irish background, in political background, someone who had been very hesitant about partition in Ireland, standing up and saying about the importance of preserving the empire by granting a measure of self-government to Indians.
Yeah, it's interesting. You have a quote somewhere in your book about the spectre of the Americas and them wanting to kind of keep a lid on this bubbling pot of self-determination that's happening all over the world. I find that quite interesting connection, because the project overall that we've been working on is all about looking at these global connections and global crossroads that converge at Mount Stewart. And one of the things that's really come across, and your work brings it brilliantly forward, is that the Londonderrys were massively global in their thinking and in their reach and in their ways of conceptualizing the world. I've got to ask the obvious question. How much was Londonderry driven by his famous ancestor, Castlereagh?
Oh, very. Teresa Londonderry had written a short pamphlet-like book on the life of Castlereagh, and this was effectively his homework for his youth, and this was drilled into him by her. I mean, she knew she could take her husband so far, and of course she herself could never achieve what, say, a woman of a later generation might, or possibly another two generations might have been permitted to achieve in the political sphere. So it was driven into the future seventh Marquess that he must emulate and attempt to live up to Castlereagh. I think it was, a child psychologist these days would probably see it as very harmful, because it does, in the end of his life, he does constantly refer back to this failure, that he has failed to live up to his ancestors. He technically wasn't his ancestor, because of course he was from a different line from the brother of Castlereagh. But nevertheless, he's a really strong sense that he'd failed to measure up to this ancestor. Of course, this ancestor had committed suicide under the most grisly of circumstances. So Londonderry's self-pity or measurement is somewhat, I report it. I don't necessarily agree with it. I do make this perhaps slightly stinging comment at the very end of the book, that he was born into enormous wealth and privilege, and instead of focusing on that, he'd focused on the negative. Now, we're all guilty of that. It's a sort of psychology of the individual in many ways, to focus on the one negative amongst an envelope of positives, for example. But he was profoundly affected by it, and felt he had failed. The fact, of course, that his last project was defending what became universally seen as the indefensible, just compounded that feeling. But it was already there.
So is it too simple to say that his desire to be the next Castlereagh led him to try and bring the great powers round a table and sort things out, and as aristocrats used to do, and he simply didn't see that was then and this is now, and that wasn't possible?
Well, in a sense, but he kept pressing. I mean, he very publicly and also in private identified what Castlereagh had done in the Congress of Vienna with what he was advocating in the late 1930s. But of course, there were obvious differences, not just of time, but these were victor powers getting together in a concert to work out Europe. And that had happened, of course, in Versailles. So in a sense, it had already been done, and in Versailles had come unstuck for all sorts of reasons. But he kept, it was almost like, if I keep promoting this idea, by association, I will be. I'm the torchbearer of the great Castlereagh, and people will listen to me on the basis of that, and it seems like a plausible template. But of course, the Munich Agreement was that. In the Munich Agreement, where the great powers sitting around the table in Prague, but again, a deeply morally questionable episode, given that the Czechs were basically told the result. But it seemed, what he'd argued for had seemed to come true on a surface level. And of course, he initially was very supportive of what happened at Munich. And as that unraveled, and increasingly became to be seen in the British public sphere as a terrible thing, he did back away from it and say, well, it's not quite what I was arguing for, and so forth.
I can't help, I mean, this is an aside really, but I can't help but feel there's an inherent vanity towards the end of his life, you know, the vanity of thinking that one man could somehow bring about an appeasement that a whole diplomatic service had failed to do. And as a woman, I can't help thinking that the way that Edith constantly kept his ego up, she was always boosting him in surreptitious ways and in obvious ways of saying, you're marvellous. Do you think there's anything to that?
Well, the Nazis encouraged this. I mean, the Nazis, Ribbentrop in particular, who adored the British aristocracy, I mean, he encouraged this notion that this type of man could be the bridge through which Britain and Germany, natural allies through the centuries, given royal connections and other connections, cultural and so forth, that an individual like Londonderry could perform this role. So after leaving office under a cloud of failure, here come, this senior diplomat, close aide to Hitler, telling him, well, you can help us achieve this. So for a couple of years he did believe it. So it wasn't just Edith encouraging him in that sense. It was the unofficial and latterly the official head of German diplomacy. But the other context of this, of course, is that the Foreign Office was widely in certain circles in Britain derided as a failure and for having all sorts of problems. That very simplistic reading of, well, the Foreign Office seemed to do so much so well in the 19th century. Why was it all seemingly unraveling in the 1920s and 1930s? So it wasn't as obvious at that point, given the failure of the League of Nations, given wider diplomatic problems, the financial problems of the early 20s and, of course, throughout the 1930s. It wasn't as obvious that conventional diplomacy worked anymore. And, of course, even if you look back into recent memory, it was Lloyd George and Clemenceau and Wilson at Versailles that moved things forward. It wasn't the hundreds of people assembled. It fell inevitably to the heads of government of the major powers. They advanced things. So it wouldn't be an entirely unreasonable assumption that still at that moment a great man could make an intervention. But certainly there's a lot of self-pity and egotism, which if you read his letters in the late 30s are an uncomfortable read because it just seems like self-pity. But his son describes meeting him after he'd been sacked from the government in 1935 as a broken man. He came back to his house in Park Lane and saw him slumped in an armchair with his legs, his long, thin legs, dangling over the arm of the chair, and said his father was a broken man. And I do get the sense
he was crying at that point.
That leaving office, it wasn't just simply he was removed from office. He felt there was a fundamental misunderstanding at the root of it, and he wasn't being allowed to correct it. He was doing the honourable thing by not correcting it in public. And so the way he ended up, in his mind, correcting it, so essentially he was accused by the Labour Party in its manifesto in 1935, its election manifesto, of being a warmonger for having preserved aerial bombing in the disarmament World Disarmament Conference, that really stung him. He really didn't want to think of himself as a warmonger. He did it for reasons to do with British interest in the Middle East, but this particularly stung him. And in his mind, a way of getting past this accusation, a way of arguing against this claim, was by promoting what he called Anglo-German understanding. Now, he never used the word appeasement, at least in anything published or public statements. He felt that they should reach an understanding. He accepted that they were an unpleasant regime, at least in public. He accepted that doing business with them would be difficult. But that's why he embraced Castlereagh, or his notion of Castlereagh, which is all the powers must come together and effectively fix the German government to certain positions. And if Germany wanted to do anything, it needed to consult the other powers, and then they'd reach some sort of agreement. So that was his answer to simply reacting to one breach after another of the Versailles settlement.
How much role did Edith play in his life story, and certainly in that last section of his life, his wife?
I think she played an enormous role. Beginning this over 20 years ago, I was struck by, unusually in political history, Edith had a lot more attention in published form than her husband. And indeed, the original version of this book was criticized by an historian for being androcentric, or focused on the man at the expense of the woman. I was a little bit stung by that, because she had so much written about her, and if anything, it was the reverse. But she had an enormous role. I mean, the social side of aristocracy is important. Family, dynasty, the notion of dynasty and dynastic survival meant that marriages were crucial. The fact that she did turn a blind eye, not happily, but did turn a blind eye to infidelity, and was, by modern standards, remarkably tolerant of that and the results of that. Meant that his marriage was stable, meant that the household was stable, but more than that, she had developed personal relationships with senior politicians that mattered. Andrew Bonar, who was a widower, she effectively stepped in and said, if you need anything in terms of hostessing, I'll take care of it. And then, of course, becomes Prime Minister, so she's the unofficial hostess to the Prime Minister. And that indirect way brings the Londonderrys into becoming the unofficial hosts of choice for the Conservative Party in the years that followed. Also famously or infamously, she was very close friends with Ramsay MacDonald, the leader of the Labour Party. The significance of that friendship can be exaggerated in terms of politics, but clearly the fact that Ramsay MacDonald, again, another man without a wife, who was notoriously never recovered emotionally from that, he came to depend on her on a certain emotional level, which helped the Londonderry family. I mean, I would see it not so much as did she help him, as the Londonderrys, like so many aristocratic families, it was a family business in that sense, and they were all engaged in the same project, and so each had a certain role to perform, but certainly hers was a crucial role in that sense.
So, talking of the family business, it surprises me that after Londonderry's death, there's quite a swift decline of the family finances, which you describe to some extent in your book. Why didn't they diversify their portfolio in such a way as they'd be protected into the 21st century?
I suppose aristocracy in some ways is an anachronistic concept, or at least felt it was by the 1920s, 30s, and was having to explain and justify itself. It didn't die out at that point, clearly, but it was having to work very hard at justifying itself. The coal industry itself was a very difficult industry to modernize as such. There were all sorts of structural problems against that, not the least of which was the division of royalties across the country, the existence of lots of smaller pits and mines, and the lack of cooperation between mine owners for sometimes business reasons, sometimes for emotional reasons of pride. But the industry itself didn't diversify, didn't invest. It was seen even in the 20s as a not quite dying, but an industry in decline, that it would never reach its high point. I think 1913 or so was the high point. And so why invest in an industry which is slowly dying? So there was no impetus or capital as such. What you would have to shut the mines, if you were. But then who would you sell them to? Who would you sell the land to? The land, as anybody from these areas or visited these areas will tell you, the land was devastated. I mean, physically scarred by mining. And various writers described the sort of the black-covered hills and the polluted rivers. I mean, this was not going to be prime real estate territory if you decided to.
So almost when Londonderry is born, it's an illiquid asset, and he's just having to manage that declining industry.
Well, he's born into it. It makes the family one of the top 20 wealthiest families in the country. But by the time he inherits the mines in 1915, they've peaked, and they're artificially sustained in the early 20s by the fact that the Western Front coincided with the industrial belt of Belgium into northern France, Germany, and so that effectively meant that British coal enjoyed a couple of years of revival, but it went back into long-term decline, hence the general strike, hence continual industrial problems into the 1930s. I mean, what happened in the end, of course, was the Labour government elected in 1945 nationalised the mines, but Londonderry was then bought out, so they still received a considerable sum of money. But the estate effectively split at that point. So his son, Robin, inherited the Durham side of things, and his wife inherited the Irish estate, or the estate in Mountstuart. And certainly his son felt that, I don't have the facts immediately to hand, but his son felt that the wealth had followed his wife rather than him, and that he had been left really stranded in this huge palatial home in County Durham with no mines, no real purpose anymore. He had lost interest in politics some years before.
Can we just deal in a little bit of depth with the fundamental thing that really upset Londonderry most, this matter of the Air Ministry, and whether he had in fact failed to allow Britain to rearm fast enough? I mean, was it the case? I mean, he got it down to arguing about numbers, but really, was it the case that he was a good chap but a bad politician? He couldn't see the writing on the wall in the bigger picture?
In a sense, but he was a ministry man, and he had spent the bulk of his time as Air Minister defending the very existence of the Air Force. So he becomes Air Minister at a time of acute financial crisis within Britain and internationally, where there's enormous pressure to disarm for moral reasons as well as financial reasons. The RAF's main role by the 1930s was in what was sometimes called colonial policing, which itself had attracted comment about its moral dubiousness, its the use of bombing or threatened bombing from the sky on out-of-the-way areas in what were regarded as tribal communities in parts of particularly northern Iraq and central Iraq. So there's a moral question against it. There was also the fear in circles, not least articulated by Stanley Baldwin, that if we allow bombing in the air in Iraq and Afghanistan, in Somalia, in Libya, then we'll have bombing in the air in London and Glasgow and so forth. And that Londonderry resisted that. He defended the existence of the Air Force and, crucially, what the Air Force did. And what the Air Force did was bomb and threaten to bomb. Hence, Labour calling him a warmonger in 1935. Towards the very end of that period, Hitler met with the British Foreign Secretary and his assistant, who was Anton Eden at the time, and he was asked by the Foreign Secretary, is the Luftwaffe what size is the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force? And Hitler said, ex cathedra, it's the same size as the RAF, if not bigger. Now that was a blatant lie. But the fears of Germany were so deep-rooted, and this goes back to the Edwardian period where people in Britain imagined the German Navy was going to be bigger than the Royal Navy within weeks or months, which was patently absurd, but people believed that. People believed the industrial capacity of Germany to achieve this. And we see it happening again in the 1930s, where people believe, against the facts, that the Germans have the capacity mentally and culturally and industrially to produce this massive fleet of planes. So when Hitler said this, he was believed. And and any historian of military or aviation historian will tell you it's an absurd claim, but it seemed plausible. And so the man who had spent years defending the very existence of the Royal Air Force was now told, right, come on, quickly, let's get on with rapid rearmament. And he said what the Air Chief said, because he was a ministry man, no, we need to take our time about this. We need to think about which planes do we build, what is their function in aerial warfare, and so forth. And that was seen as being lackadaisical and too slow, and therefore he was moved on.
But he was right.
He was the Air Ministry's man. So from the Air Ministry point of view, from the chiefs of the Royal Air Force, he was right insofar as, for example, the pressure in the wake of Hitler's statement was for rapid increase of the bombing fleet in the air. And what the chiefs of the air staff said, no, we don't need lots of bombers. We need small planes that can go up into the air and shoot the German bombers from the sky. One bomber flying towards another bomber, they just fly past each other and drop their cargo on either place. But their argument was we need small, agile planes, hence the Hurricane, hence the Spitfire, that can go up there, very light, very maneuverable, and shoot these aerial behemoths out of the sky before they reach British shores. And that resistance on the part of the engineers, the scientists, the aircraft industry itself, and the defense experts wasn't politically the thing to say. So when Londonderry is accused of, and you quite rightly say, he wasn't a good politician in that sense, he could have represented that more cleverly. I mean, Churchill's criticism of him in the end, in Churchill's memoirs, was he didn't take advantage of the circumstances to suit his own agenda well enough. And that is true.
Which Churchill was a superb player at doing, yeah. And also, I think one of the things Londonderry knew well was that, you could put limits on what military aircraft were doing, but there's still commercial aircraft that could do more or less the same thing.
Well, a military aircraft is potentially a commercial aircraft with a gun or a bomb, and that's again, Londonderry argued that when you say banning aerial bombing, what do you mean ultimately? Because any plane could be used as a weapon. I think that can be a slightly disingenuous argument at the same time. But again, if you look at the state of aircraft in the 1920s, early 30s, they were extremely primitive machines compared to what came even in the mid-1930s. Much more sophisticated airplanes were being made by that point. But there was something in that in the 1920s. I mean, the aircraft that were in Iraq, for example, were extremely rickety wooden contraptions, and were but among the airmen themselves, they were laughing about these ramshackle airplanes, and yet these very same machines were flying over tribal districts and threatening and actually bombing people. So from their point of view, these were harbingers of death. But from the pilot's point of view, they were ramshackle machines.
Tell me about this epic trip that Londonderry took, where he goes on this reconnaissance mission all over what used to be called the Far East and everywhere. Tell me about that. I mean, because this is a real early adopter of technology. All of the Londonderrys, really, but Londonderry himself.
Yeah, it was it's a reaction, in a sense, to the pressure to ban aerial bombing and therefore the purpose of the Royal Air Force. He did 2 tours of Royal Air Force bases across the empire, in a sense. And what he was trying to do, or what he felt he was doing, was highlighting to the British public that the Royal Air Force was not merely a domestic or a European entity, but it was a global, or at least an imperial presence in the world, and it performed imperial service that he would say that most people in Britain were ignorant of or unaware of, and also beneficiaries of. But really, I mean, the crude political agenda, as far as I can see, is he's reminding people of the existence of this. So the press follow him. It's an interesting thing to do. He's getting on in life at this point, so he's an unusual figure of a pilot. The Pathé newsreels anyone can access online show him jumping in and out of planes and being greeted by various people. But yes, he travels. For example, he travels up across from India into the northwest frontier and into Afghanistan, and this is sort of slightly adventure story stuff. and it does attract media attention. Um, of course, from the government's perspective, he's reminding the public of things that maybe the British government didn't want people to be so knowledgeable about. The sort of, the controversial role of the Royal Air Force in the colonial sphere was not one that necessarily sat well with the image that the Conservative Party wanted to project in the 1930s. But they knew privately it was essential. It was essential for cost reasons. If you have to garrison somewhere with soldiers, it's enormously expensive. And the Royal Navy is not much use in the Northwest Frontier or in the interior of the Middle East.
But at the time, it was considered morally wrong to use the threat of bombers upon tribal peoples.
It was increased, yes. I mean, certainly among people who would be, say, Liberal supporting or Labour supporting, supporters of the League of Nations Union, very popular voluntary organisation. Absolutely, this was a morally questionable thing. But at the same time, the question was raised, well, what is the alternative? And when Labour was in office in 1924 and again at the end of the 20s, many of the same figures who have been calling this out when in power did nothing about it. And what changed when Labour was in office is the name and how it was described. Then it was euphemisms like moral effect were used. But essentially it was the same policy, just described in different ways.
And of course, the stuff that was tried out in the colonial context was then brought home to London and elsewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, on a scale, at the same time, on a scale that was much, much larger, of course.
One of the things I really love about your work is the depth of nuance and sophistication. You don't tend to say any simple binary, this is good, this is bad. You really urge the reader to look at things from multiple perspectives and see beneath the simple sentence you might find in another Wikipedia entry or a basic story. And I think that's one of the amazing strengths of your work. What would you like to see as new work written about Londonderry or the kind of milieu of the Londonderrys? If you had it all again, what would you write?
Certainly, between the original version and the revised version, in the more recent version, I included a lot more about the coal industry and about the environmental impact of that. And critics who travelled to the northeast and commented on the Londonderrys presiding in this enormously wealthy lifestyle in Park Lane and in Mountstuart and Wynyard in County Durham, and contrasting this very pointedly with this devastated landscape. It was nice to be able to include that. I mean, again, that's partly because these questions of environmental history and the impact on the environment are much more with us by the time I went to revise this than was the case in the earlier version. And I think in terms of ownership of land and the notions of trusteeship, but also the effects on tenantry, their relationships with the landowner, and the wider local impact, if you will, I felt that more work needs to be done on that. But I also think, in a sense, the project you're involved with is addressing an important lacuna as well, which is those wider global networks that do link these places from fauna through to people and cultures and objects. That is something which, again, I did a lot more on his physical presence in empire in the sense of these tours you've just mentioned. I was able to provide much more detail on that this time. And I think the consequences of that and the sense of someone feeling that they are an imperial and a global citizen at a time when very few people, I should say, thought in those terms, let alone were able to make that meaningful. I do think he had, again, fed his ego perhaps, but I think that experience of travel and the nature of it, particularly in the modern technology of flight, gave him a certain sense of the world. And of course, after all of that, he spent most of his life in Mountstuart. So in some sense, he came back to what he considered home and brought all of that back with him.
Well, here's the million-dollar question as one Irish woman to another Irish man. Was Londonderry Irish?
He felt very strongly that he was Irish. And and we live in a more sensitive time. If someone identifies as something these days, we would accept it and see it as the right thing to do. I think for much of my youth and our youths, that was quite different. You felt you needed the approval of other people to be one thing or the other, to be one identity or another. And obviously people would have questioned his identity. I mean, I did have someone years ago when I said I was doing this, said, why don't I call the book The Marquis of Derry? I had to explain that whatever one thinks of Derry or Londonderry, that Londonderry was his name.
Marquis of Stroke City.
Yeah, it wasn't an editorial choice. It was his name. He believed he was Irish and he was British and to some extent European, but and he believed in the empire, and he believed he's part of that. Now, what he meant by each of those things, we mightn't necessarily agree with now. Indeed, some people at the time might not have necessarily agreed with it, but in the Irish context, he was seen by the government in the south of Ireland, at least before De Valera took power. He was seen as a reasonably friendly or accessible figure. And Kevin O'Higgins, who was not highly regarded by many Republicans, but nevertheless, Kevin O'Higgins suggested Londonderry as some sort of viceroy figure of a Commonwealth of Ireland. So he felt he would be the acceptable figurehead, very literally a figurehead of some type of all-Ireland federal or confederal system. Now, the idea was, this is dreaming, this is not reality, but nobody would have said that about Craig or any of the other ministers in the Northern Irish government or senior Ulster Unionists. So, or even the Dubliner Carson, who might, in that sense, given his origins, be more plausible figure. But no, Londonderry was seen as sufficiently harmless or friendly or some mixture of the two that he would be that figurehead person through which unity, the more important substantive issue, as far as O'Higgins was concerned, that unity could be achieved. And the other reason for that, of course, is Londonderry was, I describe him as a reluctant partitionist because he, in 1917 to 18 at the Irish Convention, he was not averse to some sort of all-Ireland constitutional settlement within the overarching framework of loosely the United Kingdom and or the Empire, but that didn't make any headway. But he certainly writes to his mother about one sentence particularly striking. He said we could run Ireland from Belfast, but basically saying the hard-headed unionists won't allow for that. So his Irishness is genuinely felt. Now, whether other people would label him Irish is another question, but he felt he was.
Whereas I think Edith was more of a Celticist, in the Ramsay MacDonald mode of that imagined Irishness.
Well, yeah, and a Scottishness in that sense. So it feeds our sense of Scottishness. But of course, once married and once part of Mountstuart, she very much identifies. But as you say, the Celticism is the bridge that she can cross into the north.
It's so fascinating how much of our lives have been impacted by Londonderry. Now we talk, his drive for peace, the history of partition, the schooling, the fact that he didn't want the Irish language taught in the schools, things that have massive ripples through our own lives personally, and throughout the whole history of Northern Ireland. I really admire that your pathway through this has been through nuance, that nothing is as you might suppose. And I think that's what I find fascinating about both Londonderry, his wife, the generations of women that married into the family, right back to Castlereagh. That, for me anyway, peace seems to be a theme, but also it's not what you expect. Consistently, they're not what you expect. No matter where you're coming at it from, they're not easy to put in a box.
No, of course it was peace on certain terms, but they believed, certainly he believed, he was a moderating presence. Now, the notion of moderation relies on certain notions of what the extremes are. His wife, Edith, is interesting in that they disagreed on some quite fundamental issues. One of them was tariff reform, which the current president of the United States has revived interest in tariffs. For years I had struggled teaching students about tariffs, but it's quite easy these days. The the right-wing push in the 20s, well, even before that, but mainly 20s and 30s, was for an imperial trading bloc. And Londonderry initially resisted this. Edith was very enthusiastic about it. And he resisted it for the simple reason that Durham coal was exportable. In fact, its biggest market was export not to the empire, but to other European markets and beyond. So there was a crude economic reason for that. But they disagreed with each other quite strongly. And this was an issue that tore the Conservative Party, or at least brought out very severe tensions within the Conservative Party right through to the early 1930s. The other was Edith was seen, I mean, Stanley Baldwin perceived Edith to be on the right of the Conservative Party. And later he writes to Londonderry's son saying one of your father's several problems was Edith, that Edith was seen as being more to the right, and that was unhelpful to Londonderry's reputation. He listed other reasons. He wasn't suggesting for any second it was Edith's fault, but so her political role in the marriage in that sense was a mixed blessing. Although in that sense, Baldwin may have just been looking for a reason off the shelf, and that became useful. There were lots of more important reasons as to why Londonderry couldn't remain in office.
Just last question. How do you think Londonderry is going to be thought of in 50 years, 100, 500 years? What do you think long term? Will he be forgotten?
Oh, it's a very difficult question. I mean, obviously his role in appeasement does make him infamous, and some of the things he wrote, particularly about Jewish people and Jewish influence, will forever be attached to his name, no matter what attention is addressed elsewhere, and perhaps rightly so. So he was never a man of the first rank. So people have tended to use him, and I suspect will continue to use him as a symbol of one thing or another, of, say, Irish unionism, or of coal owners, or of appeasers. He's a useful caricature. He looked like a caricature, and he is for that reason and others, he is relatively easy to caricature. And if he was a politician of the first rank, that might be more difficult. So when we talk about Lloyd George, we don't tend to think of his visit to Hitler. We think of the Labour leader George Lansbury, we don't tend to think of his visit to Hitler, and so on, because those men did other things, and those other things tend to overshadow those particular episodes. But Londonderry wasn't the Prime Minister, he wasn't the party leader. So something like that, and the fact he was an aristocrat, seems to be a useful example of something that people are glad to see the back of, and which is an aristocratic system of people who felt they had the ability and indeed the duty to do such things that we later thought were immoral and terrible.
But of course, as we were discussing over lunch, the claims of the death of the aristocracy are overblown, perhaps.
Yes, well, of course, the Londonderry's great-grandson was in recent Conservative cabinets under 3 prime ministers. He didn't have a title at the time. He now does have a title, but he didn't have a title at the time. And so the male line of the Londonderry family have not been in politics since the death of the 7th Marquess, but descendants of the 7th Marquess have achieved quite high office, relatively high office in recent governments.
Thank you, Neil. It's been an absolute honour to hear your thinking and to read this book, and I can't wait to read more of your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy.